The bar was buzzing with life, filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and a playlist of timeless hits setting the mood. In the corner, James sat quietly at a table, dressed casually, enjoying a drink and chatting with a bartender. Nothing about him screamed for attention. He blended in like any other patron. But the peace was about to shatter. Enter Officer Mike, a white cop with a reputation for throwing his weight around. As he walked in, his sharp eyes scanned the room, his posture stiff with authority. When his gaze landed on James, something shifted. Without warning, Mike approached him, his tone sharp and condescending. "You don't belong here," he barked, loud enough to turn heads. James raised an eyebrow, trying to stay composed. "I'm just here to enjoy a drink," he replied calmly. But Mike wasn't interested in listening. To him, James was just another black man who didn't fit his idea of who should be in this bar. What happens next will leave you stunned. What did Mike do? And how does James respond in a way that turns the tables entirely? Stay tuned, because this story takes a twist that no one saw coming. The night seemed ordinary, yet it carried the promise of change. James, a successful entrepreneur and the owner of a thriving bar in the heart of downtown, decided to blend in with the crowd that night. Wearing jeans and a simple hoodie, he sat in a corner enjoying the vibe he had worked so hard to create. He was proud of his bar. Every detail had been his vision, from the sleek interior to the vibrant atmosphere. As James sipped his drink, Officer Mike entered the scene. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an air of authority, Mike walked in with a purpose. He was known for patrolling this part of town and had earned a reputation for being quick to judge and even quicker to act. Mike's eyes scanned the room and they landed on James. Something about James, his relaxed demeanor, his casual clothes, didn't sit right with the officer. Mike frowned, his jaw tightening as he walked over to James's table. "Hey," Mike said gruffly, his voice cutting through the lively chatter in the bar. "What are you doing here?" James looked up, puzzled. "Just having a drink," he replied, keeping his tone polite but firm. Mike's eyes narrowed as he scanned James from head to toe. "I don't think this is your kind of place. Why don't you finish up and leave?" The bar fell silent. The surrounding patrons froze, their conversations halting as they sensed the tension brewing. The bartender, who knew James well, started to step forward but paused when James subtly shook his head. He wasn't one to let others fight his battles. "Excuse me?" James said, his voice steady but firm. "I don't think I've done anything wrong. I'm a paying customer like everyone else." Mike's face hardened, his voice rising. "I'm telling you to leave, and I don't want to hear any backtalk. Don't make this difficult." James took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had dealt with prejudice before, but this was different. This was his space. The irony wasn't lost on him that Mike had no idea who he was talking to, but James wasn't about to let the situation escalate. He stood up slowly, towering over the officer, yet keeping his movements calm and deliberate. "I'm not looking for trouble, officer," James said, locking eyes with Mike. "But I think you're mistaken." Mike took a step closer, his hand resting on his belt. "Oh, I don't think so. I know your type, always looking for trouble where it's not wanted. Now, I'm giving you one last chance to leave on your own, or I'll escort you out myself." The tension in the room was palpable. The bartender fidgeted nervously, and the patrons exchanged uneasy glances. Some even reached for their phones, sensing the encounter might spiral out of control. James remained calm, though his patience was wearing thin. "Officer," he began, his voice tinged with an edge of steel, "I think you should take a closer look at where you are." Mike smirked, his eyes flashing with arrogance. "I know exactly where I am. And I'm telling you, This place doesn't need people like you hanging around." A ripple of shock spread through the bar. People whispered among themselves, some even gasping audibly. It was clear that Mike had crossed a line, and the room braced for James's response. Instead of raising his voice, James simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small set of keys. He held them up, letting them dangle between his fingers, the sound of the keys jingling breaking the silence. "I'd like to see you try," James said evenly, his gaze unwavering. "Because this bar, it's mine. I own it." The room erupted. Gasps of disbelief and murmurs filled the air as Mike's smirk faded into a look of utter shock. His eyes darted to the keys, then to James, and finally around the bar as if seeing it for the first time. "You're lying," Mike sputtered, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. James tilted his head slightly, the hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Ask anyone here," he said, gesturing to the bartender and patrons. "They'll tell you who I am." The bartender stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "He's telling the truth," he said, his voice firm. "James is the owner. He built this place from the ground up." Mike's face turned a deep shade of red as the reality of the situation sank in. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and for the first time, he found himself on the defensive. James leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a low, commanding tone. "Now, officer," he said, "I think you're the one who doesn't belong here." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, the tension dissipating into a wave of collective relief and satisfaction. Mike stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He looked around the room, his confidence shattered. James took a step back and gestured toward the door. "You can leave now," he said simply, his tone calm but authoritative. Humiliated, Mike turned on his heel and made his way toward the exit, the sound of applause following him out the door. As the door swung shut behind him, James turned back to the crowd, his expression softening. "Thank you, everyone," he said, his voice carrying over the chatter. "Now, let's get back to enjoying the night." The bar erupted in cheers once more, and the lively energy returned. James sat back down at his table, his calm demeanor belying the intensity of the encounter. But this story wasn't over yet. The incident had been captured on several phones, and by the next morning the footage was circulating online. People across the country were praising James's composure and calling out the blatant prejudice on display. When Mike's department got wind of the incident, they launched an internal investigation. It wasn't long before they discovered that this wasn't Mike's first questionable encounter. His record was riddled with complaints, and the department had no choice but to take action. Meanwhile, James found himself thrust into the spotlight. News outlets reached out for interviews, and his bar became a symbol of resilience and justice. But for James, it wasn't about fame. It was about standing up for what was right. As the days passed, James used his newfound platform to speak out against discrimination, encouraging others to stand tall in the face of injustice. His bar thrived, not just as a place to gather, but as a beacon of hope and unity. The video of the confrontation spread like wildfire. Within hours, James's calm but firm stand had captured the attention of thousands, then millions. Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags like #StandWithJames and #JusticeServed, as users shared the video alongside messages of support. Comments poured in under the viral posts. Some praised James's restraint and poise. "This is how you handle hate, with dignity and strength." Others called for action against the officer. "How is someone like this still wearing a badge?" Meanwhile, Officer Mike's face became infamous. His arrogant demeanor and blatant prejudice were dissected in countless posts and discussions. The bar patrons who had witnessed the scene firsthand began sharing their accounts of what had happened, corroborating James's version of events. Each story only added to the growing outrage. Back at the bar, James watched the unfolding storm with mixed feelings. He appreciated the support, but he wasn't a fan of attention. He had built his bar to be a place of community, a space where people of all backgrounds could come together and enjoy themselves. To see it now at the center of a national controversy felt surreal. The next morning, as James arrived at the bar, he was met with an unexpected sight: a group of reporters waiting outside. Cameras clicked and microphones were thrust toward him as he stepped out of his car. "Mr. James, how do you feel about the video going viral?" one reporter asked. "Do you think the officer should be fired?" Another chimed in. James held up his hands, his calm demeanor silencing the flurry of questions. "I appreciate everyone's concern," he said, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. This is about how we treat one another as people. The officer's actions speak for themselves, and I trust that the system will address it." Inside the bar, his staff greeted him with a mixture of admiration and concern. The bartender who had witnessed the incident the previous night approached James hesitantly. "You okay, boss?" he asked. James nodded. "I'm fine. Let's just focus on running the bar." But focusing was easier said than done. Throughout the day, customers streamed in, not just to enjoy the atmosphere, but to show their support for James. Some even brought flowers and notes of encouragement. By evening, the bar was packed, buzzing with energy and solidarity. In the midst of the growing attention, James received a surprising call. It was from Mike's department. A representative informed him that an internal review had been launched, and they wanted to hear his account of the incident. James agreed, knowing it was an opportunity to ensure the truth came to light. The next day, he sat in a formal meeting room, recounting the events in detail. His calm, measured tone left no room for doubt. "I didn't want any trouble," James concluded. "I just wanted to enjoy my evening like any other customer. But being treated that way, in my own bar, was unacceptable. Not just for me, but for anyone." The investigation revealed a troubling pattern. Mike had a history of similar incidents, with complaints stretching back years. Most had been dismissed, swept under the rug by a system that often protected its own. But this time, with public scrutiny so intense, the department couldn't ignore it. As the investigation progressed, James began reflecting on the larger implications of what had happened. He knew his story wasn't unique. There were countless others who had faced similar discrimination but hadn't had the platform or resources to fight back. Determined to make a difference, James decided to use the spotlight to amplify those voices. He partnered with local advocacy groups and organized a community event at his bar. The theme: Standing Together for Change. The event was a resounding success. People from all walks of life gathered to share their stories and discuss ways to combat prejudice and inequality. James spoke passionately about his own experience, emphasizing the importance of unity and understanding. "We can't let hate define us," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We have to stand together and demand better, for ourselves, for our children, and for our future." The energy in the room was electric. Attendees left feeling inspired, many vowing to take action in their own communities. James's bar had become more than just a place to unwind. It was now a symbol of resilience and hope. Meanwhile, Mike faced mounting consequences. The internal investigation confirmed that he had acted inappropriately, abusing his authority and targeting James without cause. He was suspended without pay, pending further action. The news of Mike's suspension only fueled the public's outrage. Many called for his termination, arguing that such behavior had no place in law enforcement. Protesters gathered outside the police department, their signs demanding accountability and reform. For Mike, the fallout was devastating. He had never imagined that his actions would spark such a firestorm. Sitting alone in his apartment, he scrolled through the endless stream of comments and articles condemning him. His arrogance had been replaced by regret, but it was too little, too late. One evening, Mike decided to reach out to James. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he felt compelled to apologize. Gathering his courage, he walked to the bar, unsure of how he would be received. Inside, the atmosphere was as lively as ever. Laughter and music filled the air, a testament to the community James had built. Mike hesitated at the door, his heart pounding. Finally, he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room for James. When James saw him, the room fell silent. Conversations stopped and all eyes turned to the unlikely visitor. Mike approached James slowly, his posture tense but his expression sincere. "I'm here to apologize," he said, his voice barely audible. "For what I said, for what I did. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." James studied him for a long moment. The silence in the room was deafening, the tension palpable. Finally, James spoke, his tone measured. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but they're not enough. It's about what you do next that matters." Mike nodded, his eyes downcast. "I understand. And I want to do better." The exchange left a lasting impression on everyone in the bar. It was a powerful reminder that change, while difficult, was possible. In the weeks that followed, James continued his efforts to bring the community together. His bar thrived, not just as a business, but as a beacon of hope and progress. And while the scars of that night remained, they served as a testament to the strength of standing up for what's right. James's story became a rallying cry, inspiring others to challenge prejudice wherever they encountered it. And as the movement grew, so did the belief that, together, change was not just possible, it was inevitable. As the dust settled from the viral video and Mike's visit to the bar, the community around James began to rally in ways he never anticipated. His bar wasn't just a hotspot for locals anymore. It had become a symbol of resilience, justice, and unity. Strangers stopped by not just to show their support, but to thank James for standing up for what was right. His refusal to tolerate Mike's actions resonated far beyond his neighborhood, inspiring countless others to speak up against prejudice. The bar was now busier than ever. Patrons streamed in, eager to be part of the story they had read about or watched online. James, ever humble, continued greeting guests with his signature warmth. But he also used the opportunity to spread a powerful message. This wasn't just about him or his bar. It was about everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment. One evening, as James walked through the crowded bar, a young woman approached him. She was clutching a small notebook, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. James," she began nervously, "I just want to say thank you. My brother was in a situation like yours, but he didn't have the platform or the courage to fight back. Seeing you stand up has given us hope." James smiled and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for sharing that," he said. "Your brother's story matters too. And if there's anything I can do to help, let me know." As the woman left, James couldn't shake the weight of her words. Her story was just one of many he had heard over the past weeks. It was clear to him now that the fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. James decided to take action. He partnered with local advocacy groups to host a series of community events focused on education, empowerment, and reform. The first event was a panel discussion held at the bar. It featured speakers from various backgrounds, including civil rights activists, lawyers, and even a retired police officer who had dedicated his post-service years to promoting accountability within law enforcement. The turnout was overwhelming. People filled every seat, spilling out onto the sidewalk as they listened intently to the discussions. James opened the event with a heartfelt speech. "We're here tonight because what happened at this bar isn't just an isolated incident," he said. "It's part of a much bigger problem. But together, we can start to change that." The panelists shared their insights, offering practical steps for addressing systemic issues. They spoke about knowing your rights, the importance of recording incidents, and how to hold institutions accountable. By the end of the evening, the energy in the room was electric. Attendees left feeling empowered and ready to take action. Meanwhile, the investigation into Mike's actions reached its conclusion. The police department announced that he had been officially terminated. While some saw this as a victory, James knew it wasn't enough. Removing one bad officer didn't fix a broken system. He was determined to keep pushing for meaningful change. James's efforts began to attract national attention. News outlets reached out for interviews, eager to hear his perspective. During one live broadcast, the host asked him how he managed to stay so composed in the face of such blatant disrespect. James's response was simple but powerful. Anger only gives them more power over you. Staying calm lets you take control of the situation. And when you stand firm in your truth, there's nothing they can do to break you. The interview went viral, further solidifying James as a voice for change. But with increased visibility came increased challenges. James started receiving hateful messages from anonymous accounts, accusing him of blowing things out of proportion or playing the race card. While the negativity weighed on him at times, he refused to let it deter him. Instead, he focused on the overwhelming support he continued to receive. One day, James received an unexpected invitation. A prestigious university wanted him to deliver a keynote speech at their annual conference on social justice. At first, he was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't exactly his forte, and he didn't consider himself an expert on the subject. But after some encouragement from friends and family, he agreed. On the day of the conference, James stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to his shirt. The auditorium was packed, the audience buzzing with anticipation. When his name was announced, he took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. For a moment, he just stood there, taking in the sea of faces before him. Then he began to speak. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he started. "I'm not a politician or an activist. I'm just a guy who runs a bar. But life has a way of putting you in situations where you have to make a choice. Stay silent or stand up. And I chose to stand." James shared his story, recounting the night of the incident and the aftermath. He spoke about the importance of community, the power of standing together, and the need for systemic change. His words were met with thunderous applause. But the most powerful moment came during the Q&A session. A young man in the audience stood up, his voice shaking as he spoke. "Mr. James," he said, "I've always been afraid to speak out because I thought no one would listen, but seeing what you've done has given me the courage to try. Thank you." James's eyes glistened with emotion as he responded. "Your voice matters," he said. "Never let anyone make you feel otherwise." The conference marked a turning point for James. He realized that his platform could be used to inspire others and drive meaningful change. Over the next few months, he expanded his efforts, collaborating with organizations across the country to host workshops, fundraisers, and advocacy campaigns. Back at the bar, life carried on, but it was clear that things had changed. The staff worked with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing they were part of something bigger. Regulars and newcomers alike found comfort in the sense of community that James had cultivated. One evening, as James was closing up, a man walked in. He looked familiar, and it took James a moment to realize it was Mike. The former officer seemed different, his posture less rigid, his expression more subdued. "James," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I just wanted to say thank you. Losing my job was a wake-up call. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized how wrong I was." James studied him for a moment before responding. "It's never too late to change," he said, "but it's up to you to do the work." Mike nodded, his eyes glistening. "I will. I promise." As Mike left, James felt a sense of closure. While he couldn't erase what had happened, he was grateful to see even a small sign of progress. In the end, James's journey was about more than standing up to one officer. It was about creating a movement, a call for unity, respect, and justice. And as his story continued to inspire others, he knew the fight for change was far from over. The buzz surrounding James's story showed no signs of fading. It wasn't just about a single incident anymore. It had become a movement. People from all walks of life in neighborhoods far beyond James's saw his stand as a rallying cry for respect and equality. The bar had transformed into a community hub, a space where ideas flowed as freely as the drinks, and where action plans were brewed alongside coffee. One evening, as James prepared for yet another packed night at the bar, he received a phone call. On the other end was Tasha, a young activist who had been following his story closely. "James, I've been organizing community outreach events, and I think you should join us," Tasha said, her voice brimming with energy. "We want to take what you've started and amplify it." James hesitated. He was already juggling the responsibilities of running the bar and participating in local advocacy efforts. But Tasha's words struck a chord. "You're the proof that change starts with one voice," she added. "Imagine what we could do with hundreds." James agreed to attend the event, which was scheduled for the following week at a local park. When the day arrived, he was blown away by the turnout. Hundreds of people had gathered, students, professionals, parents with children, all eager to be part of something bigger. Tasha introduced James to the crowd, calling him a local hero. James smiled modestly as he stepped up to the microphone. "Hero is a big word," he began, his voice steady but humble. "I'm just someone who didn't want to stay silent, and I see that same strength in all of you. Together, we can make a difference." The crowd erupted into applause. Over the next hour, attendees broke into small groups to discuss community issues and brainstorm solutions. James moved from group to group, listening, learning, and offering his insights. One conversation stood out to him. A young woman named Amber shared her experience of facing discrimination at her workplace. Her story mirrored so many others James had heard in recent weeks, and it reinforced his commitment to fighting for change. "Amber, your courage in sharing this means a lot," James told her. "Let's make sure your story doesn't end here." Inspired by the event, James decided to formalize his efforts. He founded an organization called Voices for Change, dedicated to promoting equality and fostering dialogue between communities and law enforcement. The group's first initiative was a series of workshops aimed at educating people about their rights and de-escalation strategies during confrontations. The workshops were an immediate success. Held at community centers, libraries, and even the bar itself, they attracted people of all ages. James, along with a team of legal experts and activists, walked attendees through real-life scenarios, providing practical advice and fostering a sense of empowerment. Meanwhile, the bar continued to thrive. But it wasn't just a business anymore. It was a beacon of hope. Local artists began hosting open mic nights where poets and musicians shared pieces inspired by themes of justice and unity. One night, a young rapper performed a song titled "The Bar That Changed Everything," drawing cheers and applause from the crowd. James's story also began to influence local policy. City council members invited him to participate in discussions about policing practices and community relations. His voice carried weight, not because he was an expert, but because he represented the lived experiences of so many. During one council meeting, James addressed the room with the same calm confidence he had shown the night Mike confronted him. "We're not asking for favors," he said. "We're asking for fairness, for accountability, for a system that serves everyone equally." His words were met with nods of agreement, even from those who had initially been skeptical. Slowly but surely, James's advocacy was creating ripples of change. Amid all the progress, challenges persisted. James continued to receive hateful messages and even threats. One night, as he locked up the bar, he noticed a spray-painted message on the back wall: "Stay in your lane." Instead of feeling discouraged, James saw it as a reminder of why he was fighting. The next day, he invited a group of local teenagers to turn the graffiti into a mural. Over several afternoons, they transformed the hateful words into a vibrant artwork that celebrated unity and diversity. When it was finished, the mural became a popular photo spot, symbolizing resilience and hope. As James's efforts gained national attention, he was invited to speak at a televised town hall on racial equality. Sitting alongside activists, educators, and law enforcement officials, he shared his perspective on how communities and police could rebuild trust. "We have to start by listening to each other," James said. "It's not about us versus them. It's about all of us working together for a better future." The town hall sparked meaningful conversations, both on screen and off. Viewers flooded social media with messages of support, sharing their own stories and calling for change in their communities. One particularly touching moment came when James received a letter from a retired police officer named David. The letter read, "James, I've been in law enforcement for over 30 years, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. Your story reminded me why I joined the force in the first place, to protect and serve, not to intimidate or discriminate. Thank you for reminding all of us of what's possible when we choose empathy over prejudice." James was deeply moved. The letter reminded him that change was possible, even within systems that seemed resistant to it. Back at the bar, life carried on with its usual rhythm. Regulars joked and laughed over drinks. Newcomers marveled at the mural, and James continued to greet everyone with the same warmth and kindness. But beneath the surface, a sense of purpose fueled everything he did. One evening, as James closed up for the night, he received an unexpected visitor: Mike. The former officer looked different, less arrogant, more humble. "James," Mike began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I've done a lot of thinking since that night. I was wrong. About you, about a lot of things. I'm sorry." James studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "It takes courage to admit that," he said. "What you do next matters more than what you say now." Mike nodded, his eyes glistening. "I want to make things right. If there's any way I can help, let me know." James extended a hand, and the two men shook, a small but meaningful gesture of reconciliation. As Mike left, James felt a sense of closure. While forgiveness didn't erase the past, it offered a path forward. And for James, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, James continued his work with Voices for Change, expanding its reach and impact. The organization partnered with schools to introduce anti-bias education, and launched a mentorship program for at-risk youth. Every step felt like progress, a testament to what could be achieved when people stood together. Looking back, James couldn't have imagined how much one night at his bar would change his life. But as he stood in front of the mural one evening, watching a group of kids pose for a photo, he realized something. The fight for justice and equality wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It was about the small, everyday choices to stand up, speak out, and build a better world. And James was ready to keep making those choices, one step at a time. James's story didn't just stop at the local level, it became a national sensation. Social media amplified the tale with hashtags like Justice for James and Not Just a Bar Owner trending nationwide. The clear injustice in the officer's reaction to James owning the bar struck a chord with people from all walks of life. Discussions about racial discrimination, stereotypes, and unchecked authority in public spaces flooded social platforms, news outlets, and even political discussions. James was inundated with interview requests. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted such personal events to be dissected on national TV. However, when he saw how many people were rallying around his story, he decided to step forward, not just for himself, but for the broader message it carried. James appeared on prominent shows like Good Morning America and CNN Tonight, sharing his experience with a calm but determined demeanor. "This isn't just about me," he told one interviewer. "This is about how we, as a society, judge people based on appearances and how some abuse their power to enforce those judgments." Meanwhile, local authorities faced immense pressure. Calls for disciplinary action against Officer Miller grew louder. The department initially tried to downplay the incident, labeling it as a misunderstanding. However, the overwhelming evidence, videos, witness testimonies, and James's newfound platform made it impossible to sweep under the rug. Under public scrutiny, the mayor of the city held a press conference, stating, "This incident reflects a failure in our system. We must hold individuals accountable and reevaluate our training and policies to prevent such occurrences." Officer Miller was suspended without pay pending a full investigation. This moment wasn't just about accountability, it was a catalyst for broader discussions. Advocates for racial equality seized the opportunity to highlight systemic issues. James, who had once only dreamed of running his bar, now found himself speaking at rallies and panel discussions about racial bias, the power of community, and the importance of standing up for one's rights. His bar, now a symbol of resistance and pride, became a gathering point for discussions and events centered on equality and justice. James partnered with local organizations to host seminars, fundraisers, and even legal aid workshops for those who had faced similar injustices. "This bar was always meant to be a place where people feel safe," James said during one of these events. "Now, it's a place where change begins." Though the movement gained traction, it wasn't without challenges. Detractors accused James of seeking attention or ruining a good officer's life. Yet James remained steadfast. "This was never about one person," he reiterated in interviews. "It's about the pattern of how people in power treat others they see as beneath them." Over time, the incident led to tangible changes. The local police department implemented mandatory sensitivity and de-escalation training. A review board was established to ensure accountability in future cases. On a state level, conversations about racial profiling laws gained new momentum, partly thanks to the attention James's story had brought to the issue. Months after the incident, James reflected on how much his life had changed. His bar, once a humble establishment with regular patrons, was now a beacon of hope and transformation. Its walls were adorned with photos photos and artwork representing unity and resilience, donated by local artists inspired by James's story. James took time to focus on his personal growth as well. He joined local advocacy groups, not just to speak, but to learn. He attended workshops on systemic racism and community organizing, realizing that while he had a voice, he wanted to be as informed as possible to make a lasting impact. As for Officer Miller, he publicly apologized in a press conference after months of silence. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment," Miller admitted, his voice filled with regret. "I humiliated someone who deserved my respect, and for that, I am truly sorry." While many questioned the sincerity of his apology, James took it as a step forward. "Accountability starts with acknowledgement," he told reporters when asked about it. James forgave Miller, not to excuse the behavior, but to release the weight of anger from his heart. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or letting go of the fight," James said during a community meeting. "It means freeing yourself from the bitterness that holds you back." In the end, James's journey became a source of inspiration. His message was clear. One person's voice, amplified by a united community, can create meaningful change. He often concluded his speeches with a heartfelt appeal. We all have a role to play in building a world where everyone is treated with dignity. What role will you play? As his bar bustled with life and laughter on a Friday night, James stood at the counter watching his dream thrive. A young man approached him and said, "Your story inspired me to speak up at my job when I saw something wrong." "Thank you." James smiled, knowing the ripple effects of his actions were just beginning. James's story left an indelible mark not just on his community, but on the nation. It was a reminder that no matter how small or ordinary one might feel, standing up for justice can lead to extraordinary change. "Now it's your turn," James said in a video message to his supporters. "What will you do when faced with injustice? Share your stories, your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation alive."